Student Life Live, and a warm welcome to you, if it's your first time joining us. My name is Sally, and I work for Student Life in Wellington, and I just wanted to explain to you guys what this space is all about. So Student Life Live is a space we have created during this time in lockdown to connect with one another all across the country, build real relationships, and learn about our real and living God. Now I'll just briefly hand it over to I'll briefly hand it over to Dan to introduce our amazing speaker for today. So take it away, Dan.
Hey team, it's my privilege just to introduce our guest speaker for today. We've got bro Kris Bates. The guy's a scholar of our time. He studied at 2 universities, one in Otago, one in Oxford as well. So, I mean, the guy has something to do with, he has some fetish over universities that start with O. I don't know what that means, but looking forward to having him. Let me honor this guy as well. I mean, he works for a ministry called Thinking and Faith Ministries, Thinking Faith Matters. And so the guy always wants to be in the public square to kind of challenge, to encourage, to endorse good thinking, good truth coaching in many ways. Believes in the arts as well, because this ministry likes to orbit around understanding the arts, because the arts cultivates or brings a lot of forming towards our culture. And so I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts towards this big topic. Our hot topic for today is the magic that is fake news. And I think it was funny, just with the icebreaker question of like, what's something that we've kind of believed in many ways, but it was fake. And I just, thought about all the superstition that my nana kind of threw at me. She said if I whistle at night, I should stop whistling at night, because if the moon comes out at the right time and there's a silhouette of an old lady over there, your lips will go crooked for life. So that scared that was some pretty intense fake news for me. So no one needs to know that. Let's just go to Kris Bates right now. So Kris, how are we doing, my brother? Let's unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, brother. How you doing?
Awesome. Hey mate, really well, thank you. I just want to say before we get down to business that I really appreciate you inviting me, giving me this opportunity to speak, and the rest of the team for trusting me with this topic. So thank you guys. It really is a privilege that I don't take for granted. So really appreciate it.
Yeah. And before I hand it over to you, Kris, I have to ask, I'm wearing a hoodie right now. Just to let you know, it's a bit of Wellington merchandise, Student Life right here, is that we're freezing over here and you're wearing a t-shirt in Dunedin. What's with that?
Well, firstly, I'm actually Scottish originally. We don't feel the cold. So there's that. And then the other thing is that secretly, don't tell this to anybody because we don't want the word getting out, but the weather in Dunedin is actually much better than what the media will tell you. So that's fake news in itself, is the weather reports in Dunedin. The weather here is fantastic all year round, but we don't tell people from Wellington or Auckland that because we don't want you moving down here. So we'll keep that on the down low, bro.
Okay, I think I thought to myself, I'm cold because I have 0% fat. But that's probably fake news in of itself.
Well, mate, I was just looking at that. So you probably heard me laughing my head off at the iPhone video you just put forward. And I always present myself as being 5% thinner and 20% taller than I really am as well. So I've got a lot in common with that iPhone.
A man of knowledge. Take it away, Kris.
Thank you, brother. Hey, team, I really appreciate you all tuning in today. It really is a privilege that I don't take for granted. So thank you for putting aside some of your time to hear me speak on this topic. Before we get down to it, let me introduce myself with a couple of words. Ko ngā karaiti ana te iwi, ko te ronga pai te waka, ko maunga kawari te maunga, ko horona te awa, ko te tinaranga tiratanga te whena, ko ihu karaiti te tangata, ko te wairua tapu te kaitiaki. The family of God is my tribe. The gospel is my canoe. Calvary is my mountain. Jordan is my river. The kingdom of God is where I'm bound for. Jesus is the man, and the Holy Spirit is my keeper. This is who I am. My name is Christopher Bates. The name Christopher is a contraction of 2 Greek words, Christus meaning Christ and Pharos meaning to bear. My name means bearer of Christ. My last name, Bate, is an Old Norse name that means either house or home. So good afternoon. My name is Christopher Bates, and I have found my home as I learn to bear his name. I'm not going to tell you a whole great deal about myself because I'm probably the least interesting thing about this topic. So I don't want to sell you anything or try and market myself in regard to that. I'll tell you a couple of quick things. I am married. My wife, Jody, is actually watching this somewhere. So if you see a lady named Jody, that's my wife, give her a wave. We have been married for 14 years, past March, so 14 plus, and we have 2 kids together. Our boy is 9, and our little girl is just coming on for 7 years old. So those are a couple of fun facts about me. Right, the topic at hand is fake news. Now, just for a change, I've been thrown a massive topic with very little time to speak. So what I'm going to do to try and approach this is try and hang a framework that we can work out of. And the framework that I want to hang is 3 points. And my hope that in putting together a framework, a big picture together for us this afternoon, is that as we come to the questions, having that framework in place will then give us a context into which our questions come. And hopefully the framework will then influence the questions that we ask, but also the framework itself will start to hint at some of the answers to the questions that we're looking at. So if it's all right with you, or in fact, even if it's not, because this is all I've prepared, we're going to look at this 3-prong framework that I have for this afternoon. So when it comes to fake news, I think there are 3 key areas that we need to be thinking about. The first is the erosion of truth, the erosion of truth. The second is the proliferation of information. And the third is the loss of trust that is the result of the first 2 points. So point 1 is the erosion of truth. The second is the proliferation of information. And third is the resulting loss of trust. So those are the 3 points that I want to cover off this afternoon. So let's get down to business. We'll start with number 1 first. I find that's usually the best way to go about things. When we're talking about truth, what is it that we need to think about? We need to first define what it is that we're actually referring to. What do we mean when we use the word truth? What are we referring to? Well, often when we talk about truth, we use phrases like, it is true that 2 + 2 = 4, or it is true that the Earth is the 3rd planet in our solar system in relationship to the sun, or it is true that if you jump, gravity will draw you back to the Earth. These things are true. So truth is often referred to with regards to facts, data, and information. But there's a question that underlies that for me, and I think it's this, that what do these bits of facts, data, and information refer to? What gives these truth statements their truth value? So when we think of the examples that I've just put forward to us, these bits of facts, data, and information refer to reality as it actually is. And that's an important point. That when we talk about truth, what we're talking about, or what gives our statements their truth value, is the fact that they relate to reality as it actually is, to a truly existing state of affairs. And so what that tells us then is that truth and reality are intrinsically linked. If you discover something that's true, you'll discover something about reality. If you discover something about the nature of reality, you in turn find out something about the nature of truth. So truth and reality are intrinsically linked. This is what's known as the correspondence view of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, that which is true will correspond to that which is real. Now, that's a really important starting point for the discussion, because all of classical philosophy was predicated based upon this idea of the correspondence view of truth. So whenever a classical philosopher was doing philosophy, they worked out of this foundation of the correspondence view of truth, that which is true will correspond to that which is real. So the chief aim of classical philosophy was really to discover the unifying principle that binds together and makes sense of all of life. That was the aim of the chief aim of classical philosophy. So the philosopher would stand on his hill overlooking all of reality, wearing his toga and his Roman sandals. Don't know why Greek philosophers wear Roman sandals. It's a little bit beyond me, but there you go. So they're looking at over all of reality, and they're looking at all of the particulars of life, all of the things that are going on. So they're looking at the way we organize ourselves as human beings. They're looking at our political aspirations, our religious thinking, our psychological thought, the natural world itself. And what they're looking for is a thread that runs through all of it and binds it all together, making sense of the whole. So they're looking for a universal principle that makes sense of all of the particulars of life. And so what happens is one philosopher will look at all of that and say, aha, I have a moment, an aha moment. This, it seems to me, based on my observation and analysis of that observation, This, it seems to me, is the thread that runs through the whole of reality, binds it together, and makes sense of the whole. And so they draw themselves a big circle and say, this is my thesis, that this is the particular strand that runs through all of reality and makes sense of it all. A second philosopher then comes along and goes, I see what you've done here. You've, upon the basis of the observations that you have made and your analysis of that observation, you have identified this strand as the one that binds together all of reality and makes sense of it all, and so you've drawn your thesis here. However, you've missed a couple of very important points. You've missed this point, this point, and this point. And if you had taken notice of these, then you would have shifted your thinking as I have, and I have drawn my thesis here. And so now we have two classical philosophers with two competing views of reality. We have what's called the thesis and the antithesis. Okay? And because these ideas are based in the correspondence view of truth, what these philosophers are saying is that that their view of reality fits reality as it actually is. Now, this is called antithetical logic, thesis, antithesis. When you think in terms of antithetical logic, very neat, clear distinctions and categories emerge. Because either the thesis corresponds to reality and is therefore true, or the antithesis corresponds to reality and is therefore true. Now, so you get either or distinctions. You get either true or false. So you get either or distinctions, you get true, false distinctions. It's either the thesis or it's the antithesis. It's not both. They are mutually exclusive views of reality. And so you get either or, true, false, right, wrong. These distinctions naturally flow out of antithetical logic based in the correspondence view of truth. Now, this is the way that all classical philosophy was done. Whether you look right back to the golden age of Athens, 500 BC, right through classical philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, you name them, this is the way they all thought. But a radical change happened around the 18th century when a German philosopher by the name of Hegel turns up on the scene. And Hegel looks at the way philosophy is done and he says, look, we've been doing this antithetical logic thing for so long. Someone comes up with a thesis, another guy comes up with an antithesis, they both duke it out. One rises above the other's discarded, then a new antithesis comes along and they duke it out. And so we have this constant battle over the either or, the thesis, the antithesis, and we're just not making any headway. So what Hegel suggests is that instead of the thesis and the antithesis, we bring the two together in what he calls the synthesis. Okay, so you take the either and the or and you bring it together in the both and. It's no longer either the thesis or the antithesis, it's both the thesis and the antithesis, right? Now, this is called synthetical logic. And so when you start thinking in terms of synthetical logic, something radical happens. And what that is that you destroy all categories for the discussion about truth. Because it's not either this or that, it's both this and that. There is no more true or false. All ideas become equally valid. Your idea is not more true than mine. It doesn't reflect reality any better than mine does. Your view is your view. My view is my view. You're entitled to your view of the truth, and I'm entitled to my view of the truth. And so the big category, the big topic of truth disappears, and it becomes subjectivized. There's no objective truth. It's subjective truth. It's my truth, and I'm entitled to my personal view of truth. And so you destroy all those categories for discussing the topic of truth. German philosopher who's probably familiar to many of us, whose name I've just gone out of my head, Friedrich Nietzsche, once said that there are many sets of eyes, consequently, there are many truths, consequently, there is no truth. You follow that? There are many sets of eyes, consequently, there are many truths. Consequently, there is no truth. Friedrich Nietzsche is more famous for saying that God is dead, but this is really just an outworking of what he's saying there. God is dead. There's no objective one set of eyes that looks out over all of reality and defines it. There are only the many sets of eyes. And because there are many sets of eyes, everybody sees truth from their own perspective. They all have their own view of truth. And because everybody sees it differently and everybody has their own view, there are many truths. There's a plurality of truths. And as such, there is no one truth. There are only the many truths. Now, I'm sure you can see how that influences the way we think in our culture today. that our culture, the culture that we live in, has by and large bought into this idea, this understanding of what truth is, that there is no such thing as objective truth. There is no objective reality. You have your truth. I have my truth. Your truth doesn't reflect reality any better than mine does. It doesn't have any more value than mine does. You are entitled to yours. I am entitled to mine, and I am to live out my own personal truth. Now, that's a seriously problematic position to be in. Because what we've done in our culture is we've destroyed the very category of truth. Truth no longer is dealt with as a category in our culture. It's a personal thing. It's a subjective thing. It's just about my personal feelings as to what truth is. So here's the question. There's two things that come as a result of that. Our culture has moved so far away from truth that it has recently been labeled a post-truth culture. I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase, post-truth culture. So here's a question for you. How can we discuss fake news in a post-truth culture? Think about that for a second. How do you talk about fake news in a culture that doesn't believe in truth as a category? Because surely, if there is such a thing as fake news, then there is such a thing as true news. In other words, the very concept of fake news presupposes that there is such a thing as true news. If there is true news, what makes that news true? Well, what makes that news true is that it reflects reality as it actually is. It reports an actually existing state of affairs. Right? If there is fake news, then there is true news. If there is true news, then that news reflects reality as it actually is. In other words, we assume the correspondence theory of truth. If we assume the correspondence theory of truth, then there is an absolute reality to which these things must be held account. And so how do you talk about fake news in a culture that doesn't believe in truth as a category? The very concept is contradictory to the very values that our culture advocates and proposes to us. And that's problematic. There's an inconsistency for the culture talking about fake news because the culture doesn't believe in truth at all. That's the first problem. The second outworking of that is this. If we dispose with truth as a category, fake news is inevitably what you end up with. Fake news is inevitably what you end up with. Why? Because truth becomes not an objective reality to which we are all accountable. Truth becomes a subjective feeling. I have my own personal view of truth, and then I put that personal view of truth out there into the world. And that's all that fake news is. It's people putting out their idea of truth into the world. More particularly, what we do when we destroy the concept of truth in our culture, we reduce everybody to liars. Because all we do is we take our idea, our understanding of the truth, we take it and we put it out into the world from our own subjective position. This is what I feel. This is what sits best with me. This is what suits my agenda, my purposes best. And that's all that fake news is. It's someone or a number of people putting out their version of the truth as it suits them and serves their agenda best. When you dispose of truth as a category in the culture and subjectivize something like truth, fake news and propaganda, because that's all fake news is, fake news and propaganda is all that you are left with. It's the logical result of abandoning truth. And so when we talk about the post-truth culture and we talk about fake news in a negative context, what we're really highlighting is the symptom of a very much bigger problem. It's a symptom of the problem of abandoning truth to begin with. So when we look at our culture, we can see the negative effect of fake news on the culture. We can see the damage that is wreaking in our culture, in our civilization, in our families, in our societies. We can see the problems, but the problem is only a symptom of a much bigger problem. The real issue is the question of truth. We can't function as a society without objective truth to which we are all accountable. So the very notion of fake truth should highlight for us the fact that we can't walk away from truth in our culture. and sustain the societies in which we live. So that's the first issue. The second issue that I raised was the proliferation of information. In our age in which we live, it's often referred to as the information age for obvious reasons. You know, I've grown up in my time, the information superhighway was the language of the internet back in the 90s. I was already left school by that stage and was working. But the information age is the age in which we live. And in our time, we have bought into a very much false premise that knowledge is power and information equals knowledge. Therefore, information to be informed is to be empowered. This is false. That's the way our culture thinks. Knowledge is power. To be informed is to have knowledge. Therefore, information to be informed is to be empowered. This is not the way it works. In fact, I would argue it's precisely the reverse of that. Let me give you an example. I like to do the supermarket shopping in my family. I do the cooking often, and I enjoy cooking. I enjoy shopping because of those two things are intrinsically linked, right? But the other side of it is I enjoy watching people. I enjoy watching people as they go about their lives and just seeing how people behave. And one of the things that I've noticed over recent years is that when you go to the supermarket, you inevitably at some point find someone standing in front of a supermarket shelf going, just completely bemused. Completely bemused. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever gone to the supermarket and just felt completely overwhelmed at the sheer volume of choices in terms of the products that you want to buy? You just stand there, just completely bemused. What on earth do I do with all of this? That's not an empowering feeling. That's a disempowering feeling, right? When I was growing up, you know, in the 70s and 80s, you know, you go to the supermarket to buy breakfast cereal, right? You didn't go, you go to the supermarket, you turn up, and you'd look at the breakfast cereal bay. So there might be 6 shelves with breakfast cereal in. You'd have Wheat Bix and cornflakes and maybe rice bubbles and porridge oats. And then this amazing product came out somewhere in the 80s called muesli that revolutionized the world, right? Everybody was into muesli. But you would basically have this one bay of products to choose from. So there might be, let's say there was 10 products. You don't go to the breakfast cereal bay at the supermarket. You go to the breakfast cereal aisle. There's an entire aisle of breakfast cereal. So there's not just Wheat Bix, there's 50 different kinds of Wheat Bix, right? Well, I just want Wheat Bix. Which one do I choose? Are there any differences between these boxes of Wheat Bix? Or is it in fact the same product in a different box at a cheaper price point? I don't know what I'm buying anymore. And so you stand there with this immediate sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer number of options available to us. And we're incapable of making a choice. We feel a paralysis that comes on the back of that overwhelming tsunami of choice. You know, we've reached the point with information where we've hit information saturation. Right? Where there's a tsunami of choice and options and information with which we are being constantly washed over every minute of every day, and we've become paralyzed as a result. But that paralysis isn't the worst of it, because underlying that paralysis, there's a constant bubbling of anxiety that comes with that sense of being disempowered. And so our culture is, even though we have access to more information than any other generation before us, we are the most ignorant generation that's ever walked the earth. I don't say that pejoratively to you, it's just true. That's a statement that corresponds to reality. Right? You're welcome. But the fact of the matter is, why is that the case? Because we have just been overwhelmed with so much information, we don't know what to do with it anymore. We don't know what to do with it. How do you make choices as to what's right or wrong when the choices are limitless? They're unending. How do you sift through it all? And so the saturation point is reached, paralysis is the result, and there's this anxiety that's constantly rising in the face of those two things. What happens to a culture when it is paralyzed and anxious? Let me suggest nothing good, right? Nothing good. Paralyzed, anxious people do very strange things. Right? You end up with divisions within a culture. tribalized divisions. Because what people do is they make their choices not based on the information, not based on having weighed their way through it and sifted it, but they grab bits and pieces that feel good to them. In our culture, we've made the serious and grave error of thinking that to be informed is to be empowered. The fact of the matter is that that is wrong. The amount of information that we have has paralyzed us. There is a vast gulf that resides between information and knowledge, and that gulf is called critical reasoning. But we don't teach it anymore. We don't teach people to think. We don't teach people to critically analyze information. Because it's only when you critically analyze information that it becomes knowledge. And only when you learn to apply that knowledge in the best possible way does that knowledge become wisdom. We've circumvented the entire process, taking information as knowledge and power. But information must be critically analyzed before it becomes knowledge. And knowledge must be reflected on so that we know how to use that knowledge in the best possible way, and that is wisdom. But we don't think anymore in our culture. We don't teach it. Why not? Because it's not fashionable anymore to think. You know, I'll give you an example of this. Go back 10, 15 years, and it would not be unusual to hear someone say in a regular conversation, you know what, I think that, ... Or in a board meeting, someone would say, I disagree with you there because I think that ... You don't hear that language in our culture anymore. That is gone. What do people say instead? I just feel that. Thinking has been replaced by feeling. And I would suggest to you that that's intrinsically linked to our abandonment of the truth. Because when you abandon the truth, you stop using reason as the means by which to work out that which is true and corresponds to reality. And instead we use the feelings as the antenna by which we suss out and work our way through the life and our experience of that life in the world in which we live. And so feeling becomes the ultimate where thinking is discarded. And if you want further evidence of that, what is one of the chief sins of our day that must never be done? You cannot offend anybody. You can't hurt their feelings. Why? Because to hurt their feelings isn't simply to say that they are wrong in their thinking. It's to undermine their very foundational understanding of reality as it is and their place within it. And you can't do that without attacking the person themselves. That's what happens when we reduce our understanding of reality and our place in it to our feelings. But that's how we feel our way through reality. We don't sift our way through information, critically analyzing anymore. We just grab bits that feel good and stick them in our back pocket. And that's what I'm going to think from now on. And that suits me and that suits my agenda. Right? Further evidence of that, have you noticed that news isn't news anymore? We don't have investigative journalists the way we used to. What do we have? Opinion pieces. Opinion pieces. The investigative journalist is something of a bygone era. Instead, now we have a talking head, a personality. And so we take our information not from the investigative journalists having critically analysed the information they present. We take the personality that we like and that suits our perspective, and we get our news from that person, regardless of whether what they say is true or not. It suits me and my agenda and my purposes and makes me feel good having them tell me what to think. That's a necessary consequence of abandoning truth, folks. Which brings us to the last point, the loss of trust that results from these two things. Here's a question. How can we trust people in a culture that doesn't believe in truth as a category? When truth is subjective, all that you are left with is one person's view based on their feelings of reality versus another person's view based on their feelings of reality. How can we trust anybody in that context? You can't trust people who aren't truthful with you. You can't trust people who play fast and loose with truth. You can't trust people who view truth not as something that corresponds to reality as it actually is, but something that suits their purposes and their ends and makes them feel good. You can't trust in that context. And so there has been a necessary and logical loss of trust that has resulted from the erosion of truth and the proliferation of information. A number of years ago, there was a study done for some Canadian university students. And the question was asked, what is the biggest problem facing your generation in our day? And in some way, shape, or form, using their own words, of course, the majority of them answered, we don't know who to trust. In a society that doesn't believe in truth, in a society that is overwhelmed by the sheer number of choices that are available to us, in a society that feels paralyzed and disempowered and anxious, in a society that doesn't know who it can trust and doesn't believe that they can trust anyone. How do we function in that society? These are all symptoms of a much bigger problem. These are all symptoms. We can see it, the power of it outworking in our communities and our societies. We can see the power of what's happening. They're all symptoms of a much bigger problem, and the bigger problem is that we've walked away from God and as such walked away from truth. That's the real issue here. And these are the necessary and logical outworkings of abandoning God and consequently abandoning truth. We can't survive without Him. We can't function as people without Him. We can't function as societies without Him. There are real consequences for all of us when we abandon God and abandon truth. You know, before He was taken to be crucified, Jesus was interviewed by Pontius Pilate, the Roman official of the day. And Pilate said to him, he wanted to know whether or not Jesus was a king, because he was worried that Jesus was setting himself up in opposition to the Roman Empire. Jesus says, you have rightly spoken, I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this earth. If it was of this earth, then my people, my followers, they would have risen up, taken up their swords, and they'd fight you. But I am that kind of king. He says, all that are on the side of truth, listen to me. And Pontius Pilate looks at Jesus and he says, what is truth? Turns and walks out. If only he had known to whom it was he was speaking. If only he had known who he was asking the question of. You see, Jesus is the one that claims to be the way, the truth, and the life. He's the one that claims to be to be able to tell us who God is, what the nature of reality is, what our true nature is, and what our genuine purpose and destiny is. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me, says Jesus. He's not the sort of king that's going to take up a sword and fight for his power, for fame, celebrity, for marketing purposes or PR or optics. He's not interested in any of that. He's not the sort of king that lords it over his subjects, subjugating them. He is a king who tells us the nature of reality as it actually is and is truthful about the extent of our own hearts. And let's be honest, folks, we are all liars. We all play hard, fast, and loose with the truth. We twist it to our own ends for our own purpose to make reality fit our needs based on our feelings. He knows this and he deals with us and trusts us and loves us all the same. He says, I know the state of your heart, and yet I love you. He lays down his life for us, that we can be reconciled to God and plugged back into reality as it actually is. Now, that's a statement that's either true or it's false. It reflects reality as it actually stands or it doesn't. Let me share this with you in closing. I have trusted Jesus now for nearly 20 years. I've trusted him in terms of believing who he says he is and believing his version of reality, that it is true. It reflects reality as it actually is. That he's truthful about who he is. That he is God come into human history as one of us, a human being. He's truthful about who I am, broken, sinful, hurting, hurt person who hurts others. I've trusted what he has said. And more than that, I have entrusted my life to him. and he has never let me down. And my encouragement to you today is to turn away from this false ideal of our culture that truth can be disposed of and done away with no consequence. Folks, it's payday someday. There is a price for abandoning truth, and you will each pay it. We will all pay it. He says, I've paid it for you. I've paid the price that you might be free to live your life in a new way, to have eternal life and life in its fullness. These words you can trust, and I encourage you to do so today. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. Sally, I throw it back to you.
Oh, thanks, Kris, for just what you've shared. I personally have just learned so much over it, just looking back at the consequences of our fake news, of just being really real with what reality is, that one day we will have to pay for the consequences of just us denying truth. And thank you for reminding of what truth is, and that truth lies in Jesus. Thank you so much, Kris. It was so awesome.
Well, team, Q&A. Listen, before we start with the Q&A, let me just say a couple of quick words. One in particular. It's easy to assume that because someone's been invited to speak to a subject that they must be an expert. I'm no expert. I've done some thinking, I've done some research, but I'm not an encyclopedia. All right. I just want you to know that I will answer your questions as best I can, but there may be questions that I can't answer. If there are questions that I can't answer, I'll give you this, that I will certainly work with you to find the questions, because I believe there are answers to the questions of our hearts and minds. And I'm sure that the rest of the Student Life team feel the same way, that they will commit themselves to finding the answers to the questions that you have if I can't find them for you. So as long as we all understand that I'm not an encyclopedia, and that I don't have the answer to every single question, I'm more than happy for you to shoot. Go for it. Dan, just a quick point, brother. Am I taking these questions from this stream of chat? That's what's happening. Thanks, bro. Lots of applause for Maya. Well done, Maya, by the way. Congratulations. Thank you for your kind words, folks. There's lots of very kind comments here. Kris, you've got a great voice for radio. Shame about the face. Totally agree. That's a joke that no one really said that. We probably all thought it. What am I missing? Too many Whittaker chocolate ads. How can you have too many Whittaker's chocolate ads? Whittaker's is great. Cocoa Pops. I did forget Cocoa Pops. I'm sorry, but they came out in the 80s when I was a kid, so they were a late comer.
Sorry for the Whittaker's expression there, brother. If you just kind of scroll right to the end of that chat, then you'll start to see some of those questions popping up, brother.
It's the top or the bottom, the end, man. Oh yeah, it's at the bottom. Okay. How do we deal? Any tips on sifting from media bias? Enoch Chan, how you going, brother? I love that guy. Which is the first question? What resources would you recommend to learn more from Maya? It's your day, Maya, isn't it? And Maya, there's some great resources available on the topic of truth, because I think that the issue of fake news is really a symptom of a much bigger problem. And we need to deal with that big problem, the big issue of truth. Because of that, the fact of the matter is that when it comes to fake news, I think we live in a time where it is so difficult to decide what is true and what is not from what we're presented with. You know, there was a time when if there was a state secret, for example, that needed to be kept, that they didn't want broadcast to the rest of the world, it would be filed away in a locked cupboard somewhere in a safe with a big rubber stamp saying top secret on it. That's not the case these days. You don't need to do that. Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill once said that the truth is of such value that it's often surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And that's very wise words. Today, instead of hiding things in locked cupboards with top secret stamps on them, people just stick the truth out there in the media. They just stick it out there in social media because it becomes part of the overall white noise that we're all influenced by and overwhelmed by. So it becomes just another conspiracy theory amongst all the other competing conspiracy theories, and it just gets lost in the noise. And that's really a big problem. So I actually think that it's difficult for us now to get to the bottom of what's true and what's not with regards to the news and what's going on in the world. So for me, the more important thing is to have that big question of our worldview sorted, that we know whether or not there is a God, and if there is a God, who this God is, and if there is a God and who he is, then what does that mean for me, and what does it mean for my place in the world and reality, and what does it mean about my life, and what does it mean about the ultimate end of life? You know, because once you get those things sorted out, then the question of what's happening in the news media becomes very much a small issue. Because we have faith and trust and understanding of what's coming, we have hope for the future, regardless of how bleak our current situation is. So I think we need to deal with that big question of truth. And on the topic of truth, I would recommend to you Doug Groothuis's book, Truth Decay, is a very good resource. So Doug Groothuis, Doug Groothuis is spelled in a way that doesn't sound like it says GROOTHUIS. Doug Groothuis, Truth Decay. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I know Os Guinness has done some work in this area as well. He's always worth listening to, Os Guinness. And William Lane Craig has a book with J.P. Moreland, which is called The Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview, and he deals with the issue of truth in there. So those are some resources that will help you with that big picture question, and that will help you deal with the fake news issue. I hope that's helpful, mate. Cool. What's next? Thank you, Chris. Sweet as. You've talked about the consequence of abandoning truth in the world. Any thoughts about how it specifically affects the church? Oh, boy. Yes, I do. I've got lots of thoughts on that. If Jesus is who he says he is, and I believe he is, FYI, heads up. But if Jesus is who he says he is, then we need to listen to him. Because Jesus says that he's God made flesh. He's God who has come into human history as one of us. And he reveals to us the truth about reality, the truth that reality isn't independent. It doesn't stand alone. Our universe doesn't stand alone. It's dependent upon God for its existence. God called it into existence, called it into existence by the word of his mouth. And it's God that sustains it. And so if Jesus is who he says he is, then by goodness, we'd better listen to him. But all too often, and particularly in our postmodern culture, I'm sure you're all familiar with that phrase, postmodern and postmodernism, we want to reinvent the wheel and deconstruct what Christianity is. We want to reinterpret what Jesus is for our own ends. And often that's to make us more palatable to the world around us. But the fact is that if Jesus is who he says he is and his word is truth, then we had better listen to him. We can't reinterpret his words for our own benefit, to make our lives more comfortable, to make the message more palatable. We need to be witnesses to Jesus. You know, in 2 Corinthians 5, the believers are referred to as ambassadors of Christ. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought much about what an ambassador is, but an ambassador is someone who is empowered to represent a people or a nation in a foreign country. An ambassador doesn't speak their own words. An ambassador speaks the words that they are given to speak by those who have empowered them, by those whom they represent. So an ambassador has no power on his own home turf because an ambassador represents the rightful authorities. And so the rightful authorities, in terms of a government, they have the power. An ambassador doesn't on their own home turf. The ambassador represents the rightful authorities on foreign soil. They don't speak their own words for their own benefit, for their own comfort. They speak the words that have been given to them by those who have empowered them, those whom they represent. And that's got to be us as the church. If Jesus is who he says he is, then we had better take his word, his message, his gospel to the people. And we better live lives that reflect the truth of who Jesus is. Anything else is capitulation to the spirit of the age and a betrayal of the trust with which we've been entrusted. That God is making his appeal to the world through us. Be ye therefore reconciled to God. There's much more I could say on that. There really is. And if you want to email me specifically on questions of that nature, admin@thinkingfaith.co.nz. admin@thinkingfaith.co.nz. I can even type it in here. Hang on. Boom. I spelled faith wrong. How good is that? My typing skills are not up to scratch. Sorry, folks. That should be an I and not an O. I am fallible. I hope that answers your question, guys. And yes, there's a lot that we could say there. Any tips on sifting from media bias, filtering through media bias? Yes, here's the first thing. How do you know that the devil is lying? Question. Answer. His lips are moving. Right? What do I mean by that? Don't trust anything you see in the media. Just don't. You're better off not to. You know? I referred earlier on to the idea of how our journalism, the trend in journalism, has moved away from investigative journalism to opinion pieces. So, because opinion is about my view of truth and what's going on rather than actual correspondence to reality. And so everything's tending and trending towards opinion pieces, right? And so what the news media do is they put the personalities in front of camera whose opinion pieces are valued by a specific demographic so that they can advertise certain products to that demographic. The news media isn't about news anymore. It's about money. And it's about selling advertising. Don't believe anything you see in the media. Don't believe what you see in the mainstream media. It may be true, it may not be. It may not be, but take it with a grain of salt. Approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Okay? Because I think that's just the right way to go. In terms of sifting through it, man, it really is one of the hardest jobs in front of us today. And man, I really feel for not folk of my age so much. I'm in my mid-40s now, but you know, guys your age and younger who are coming up through a culture that just has this total disregard for truth. I don't know how people survive without faith in this culture. I really don't. And I think that we're seeing the results of all of those things in our suicide statistics, in our mental health and mental illness statistics. Because it's so hard now to tell the truth from the lie. In terms of tips, you know, it comes down to correspondence with reality. The question is, how much evidence are you going to be able to gather? That's the real issue. So when testing ideas, there are three key areas that need to be held in mind. The first is logical consistency. Does what I'm being told make reasonable, logical, rational sense, or is it self-contradictory? Okay, that's the first. The second criteria is empirical evidence. Is there any evidence to support what I'm being told, or does the evidence lead me in a different direction? That's the second. And the third is existential relevance. Is what I'm being told livable in the real world? Does it make sense in real world terms, in real world life? Or are there real problems here that can't be resolved? Why would someone do that? Why would those actions be taken? What would they have to gain? Those experiential questions need to come into play. Now, those are the three criteria. So there's logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and existential relevance. Those are the three criteria. Now, beyond that will help us understand whether or not the claims that are being made correspond to reality. So that will work out the correspondence question. But there's another aspect of truth that we didn't get into because we simply didn't have time, and that's called the coherence view of truth. That the ideas that we're being told need to cohere. In other words, so you might find one news item that passes the three criteria. But when you start adding news items to news items and an ongoing, unfolding story, what we are told in terms of the information that we're presented with, the evidence and the existential relevance, they need to cohere to one sensible, understandable, coherent story. If they don't, there's a problem. Does that make sense? Has everybody followed that? So there's the three criteria by which we test truth. We test whether it's consistent, intellectually consistent, or whether it's self-contradictory. Whether there's any evidence to support what we're being told, that's the empirical evidence question. The logical consistency. Those three criteria will help us understand whether or not what we're being told corresponds to reality. And that will give it some legitimacy. But the next issue we need to address is the coherence question. When you take all of those three criteria and address the answers that are given at each level of those criteria, do they cohere to make a coherent whole? Or does the story find itself full of holes and contradictions? Those are just some tips. The issue is always going to be whether or not we actually have enough evidence, whether we can find enough evidence, whether we have, while we might have access to the evidence, where we can actually get hold of it amidst all of the white noise that we're surrounded with. And that's why I say that you really got to take the big question of truth first, find out what the big worldview question is, because that will minimize the significance of the fake news with which we're presented. I hope that makes sense. How do we deal with Christians who spread conspiracy theories? I came across an American pastor on YouTube 2 weeks ago claiming that Bill Gates engineered the COVID-19 pandemic as a prelude to the one world government. He laced his claims with references to Revelation and Daniel. How should we as Christians deal with such claims? Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? It's really difficult. First, I think we as Christians need to be really reticent about drawing such parallels between what's going on in the news media and what's going on in prophetic work of Scripture, Daniel, Revelation. I think we really need to be very reticent to do that, because we are fallible. We are fallible. Our understanding is limited. The real issue for us as Christians isn't a question of eschatology. That's not the real issue. I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying it's not the issue. Our issue as Christians is a question of Christology, who is Jesus, and soteriology. How are we saved? And then after that, it's ecclesiology. What is our role as believers, and what's the role of the church? Those three are the big three. And then we can start talking about eschatology after that. Because the reality is, one way or another, in terms of the way that the whole thing plays out in terms of in the world and God with his return and all that stuff, we're going to find out one way or the other. We will all find out who's right and who's wrong. And so the real issue is to make sure you're on the winning team, and to make sure that you're representing Jesus well, that you're living for him faithfully. Right? And we have to have an eye on the times, absolutely. But always be reticent to draw direct comparisons between the Bible and what's happening. I would hate to be found out that I was entirely wrong on the basis of what I said with regards to Revelation and current world affairs. Because it erodes your credibility. It erodes your personal credibility. Now, we need to have an eye on the times. And we need to be thinking about the days that lie ahead. And folks, I'm just going to be perfectly honest with you. And I know that there are folk here on this chat who are not believers in Jesus. And so I want you to listen into a discussion here. The days are getting dark, folks. The days are getting dark. And it's getting harder and harder to live faithfully for Christ in this world in which we find ourselves. And the challenges are getting more and more difficult. The obstacles harder to overcome. And there is a turning within our culture that is not only making it hard to live for Christ, but making it unpalatable. And so we have to have an eye on the times. And we need to be prepared. But come what may, the way that we are prepared is by trusting Christ. That's how we're prepared. And so we're prepared when we trust Christ with our finances. When we're thinking of the way that we're living, we're not spending beyond our means. We're not racking up huge debts. We're not putting ourselves in a position of being totally at the mercy of the banks and the government. We need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of the community that we're called to be a part of. And that we need to be prepared for a time when preaching the gospel is not going to be permitted, whether that's today, tomorrow, or 100 years from now. And whether we stand in the face of persecution is not a question of whether or not today's events marry up with the book of Revelation. Whether we stand in the face of persecution is a matter of whether or not we trust Jesus. I don't know, I haven't worked out every minutiae of detail of what's happening in eschatology. In the book of Revelation, some of it I find baffling and confusing, I'll just tell you straight up. But I trust Jesus. And I work out the big ideas and the big consequences, and I trust him with my life. That when that day comes, if it should come in my lifetime, I will stand for Christ. And I really want you as believers to be able to say the same thing. And that's not a matter of working out your eschatology. It's a matter of working out your Christology, your soteriology, and your ecclesiology. Those are the big issues. Focus on that. And I would encourage people to, yes, keep an eye on the times, but don't draw direct comparisons between what's happening now and what's happening in the book of Revelation. It doesn't benefit anybody. We need to be prepared. But the way that we are prepared is by entrusting more and more of ourselves to Christ. And that's important to understand too, because in our consumeristic culture, we tend to want more and more of Christ for us. But the truth of the Christian faith is he wants us to commit more and more of ourselves to him. I hope that makes sense. Trust Christ. He's trustworthy. How do you deal with situations, people, who see instant perceived fruit to living a feelings-based life? Os Guinness is definitely the goods. William Lane Craig is fire. So good. Os Guinness. Honestly, if you're interested in apologetics, Os Guinness has a talk. It's a 4-part talk called The Essence of Apologetics. And it's available on a website called bethinking.org. bethinking.org, The Essence of Apologetics. That talk revolutionized my thinking. It just turned everything I thought upside down in the best possible way. And I recommend it to everybody that I speak to. bethinking.org is the website. The talk is called The Essence of Apologetics. Get your hands on it. It's amazing. How do you deal with situations of people who see instant perceived fruit? Well, yeah, our culture really is set up towards instant gratification. But the question isn't, or it shouldn't be, instant gratification. It's long-term gain. And long-term gain comes from living a life that reflects reality as it actually is. You know, and there's so many strings to that, but there's so many things that we need to work through in that. And I really think there's so many things we need to think about with regards to the way we preach the Christian faith and the way we preach the gospel, that we need to work through more clearly. You know, right at the very heart of the Christian worldview is the understanding that all of reality is relational at its core. All of reality is relational at its core. Why? Because God is the ground of all reality, and God exists as an eternal relationship in the community of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So God is a relational being. Reality reflects something of the character and nature of God. Romans chapter 1. Reality is relational at its core. Human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. We are made as relational beings. Genesis 2:18. It is not good for the man to be alone. Isolation causes psychological, spiritual, physical harm. You know? And so when you connect to reality as it actually is, there is a long-term benefit which might not be seen in the short term. So there's always going to be short-term gain in living a feelings-based life, because the entire idea of a feelings-based life is gratifying my own desires. But what do you do when those desires are no longer gratified by your short-term actions and your short-term vision? You know? I think of Oscar Wilde as an example. You know, Oscar Wilde was the quintessential hedonist. The quintessential hedonist. He was all about living his life in such a way so as to gratify and fulfill every one of his physical and carnal desires. He gained real fruit out of his short-term satisfaction, but in the end, it killed him. And it left him bereft of any sense of self-worth. It left him bereft of any sense of pride in who he was and his own integrity as a human being. It left him with an immense sense of guilt to what he had done to other people around him. And on his deathbed, leading up to the days where Oscar Wilde died, he called for a priest so that he could pray for forgiveness and receive the forgiveness that comes through Christ. He experienced a great deal of short-term gain, but in the long term, it robbed him of his very soul. And he had to turn towards the eternal reality rather than the short-term vision. And the eternal reality was that he was a broken man who had broken other people. And then he needed to be forgiven and restored. And he turned to Christ as the only means by which we can be saved. There is always a reward in short-term gain, but you will always pay the price eventually. Thanks, bro. Cheers, Chris. Thanks, Chris. Great answer, my bro. Thank you, everybody. It seems like those. Yeah, the last of the questions, guys. I'm so thankful to you all, and so appreciate everybody sacrificing their time to hear this old mug having a yarn. But I pray that God has used it for His blessing, for His glory, and I pray that He uses it for your good. If you don't know Christ, turn to Him. I pray, I plead with you, turn to Christ. You can trust Him. He will make something of your life far greater than you could ever make of it yourself. May God bless you richly all.
Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's Student Life Live. We really hope that you guys had a great time connecting with people across the country and learning from our really awesome guest speaker. If you feel that you'd really like to talk to somebody a little bit more about today's topic, maybe individually or one-on-one, please head to our Facebook page, Student Life NZ. And if you private message us there, we'll be able to connect you with someone in your region who can help you process through today's topic. We also have an Instagram account called Student Life NZ. So if you head over there and give us a like and follow there, you'll be able to see some really awesome gospel media, and you'll also be able to contact us directly there as well. If you've heard about this personal relationship with God that you can have today, and maybe you're hearing about it for the first time, or you're not really sure what this means, please head over to our website, studentlife.org.nz/gospel. And there you'll be able to read about how to have a personal relationship with an awesome God. After you've had a read through this, please do connect with us on Instagram or Facebook, and we are super happy to chat with you, maybe answer any questions that you might have, or point you to some more resources where you can learn more about this awesome God. So once again, thanks so much for coming this week, and we hope to see you guys back here next week for our new topic. See you guys then. Bye!